Hey folks, in this video we're going to be discussing how to automate data delivery from one Google Sheet to multiple Google Sheets. So we are going to be creating this script here, which is going to take data from one workbook and then send it to multiple workbooks all at once. So in order to facilitate this, we're going to be using Google Drive. We're going to have a sheet with data, and then we are going to have a folder that will allow us to add or remove sheets. And then we're going to have a script that we are going to automate to run on an hourly or daily basis, whatever. And it will take data from our source sheet and it will send it to multiple sheets so that we can facilitate the needs of more than one person. So we're going to be moving a little bit fast today, and we are going to build off of my two previous videos, which is a level 1 data automation video and a level 2 automation video that uses the spreadsheet ID in order to collect data. So if you want to catch up on some of those principles, those videos exist. Otherwise, we're going to begin by going to your Google Drive. You're going to want to create a workbook that has data in it that you want to send to more than one workbook. We're going to make a new folder, and we are going to call it data endpoints. You can call anything in this video anything you want to. I chose data endpoints because that's what came to mind. Now you will create one Google Sheet, and you will call it whatever you want to. For me, I'm going to call this data endpoint 1. And what I would encourage you to do is figure out how many tabs you want in your workbooks. As we've talked about in the past, every sheet 1, so like as soon as you create a Google Sheet, has an ID of 0. The moment that you add new sheets to your workbook, you get a unique set of numbers that represents the unique ID of that sheet. When you make a copy of a workbook, like we're about to do, so instead of calling this data endpoint 1, I'm going to call it data endpoint 2. I want you to notice that we will get sheet 1 or we'll get ID of 0 for sheet 1. And that, so you can see up here, we get sheet 1 ID of 0. Sheet 2 ID is the exact same one as its copy. So you can see it's 2101 60 136. When we go back to endpoint number 1, check it out. Sheet number 2 is also 2110 160 136. This is crucial when you're trying to set up data pipelines to automate data delivery when you have more than one sheet that you want to send to a workbook. So make sure that whatever template you create is as well formed as possible so that you can facilitate future actions that will empower you to automate solutions. Cool. So I'm just going to do two workbooks so that you can see that we have two. And those will exist in this data endpoints folder, which is different than our top level folder. So for context, I have a folder that's called level 3. I have an example folder, and then I have a demo folder. Within my demo folder, I have my data source sheet. So this is the sheet that has the data that you want to send somewhere else. Then we're creating a subfolder within our primary folder, which in this case is called demo, where our endpoints will exist. So I have a blank workbook called data endpoint 1, data endpoint 2 that exists within the data endpoints folder. At the top layer of my demo folder, I have my demo automate data delivery to multiple workbooks. This is going to be the place where all of my data exists. So with that out of the way, we're going to go to Google Apps Script. Now, I already opened up a Google Apps Script, but you can access it by going to the extensions menu and then going to Apps Script. Just so that you know, I've already provided permissions for this video. If you've watched some of my previous videos, whenever you access the spreadsheet app or the Drive app, you have to allow permissions. As I've noted previously, do not allow permissions to scripts that you are not familiar with. As long as you are following the instructions in this video, you don't have to worry about it. But when you allow permissions to Drive app or spreadsheet app, you're allowing the app script to create, read, update, and delete data in your folder drive and in your sheet drive. So do not allow nefarious actors access to your workbooks. I've already done that because you don't have to see me give permissions. My previous videos have if you want an example of it. So how we're going to begin today is I thought I'd take this a little bit differently, and I'm going to create an outline of what we're going to do, and then we're going to fill in the pieces. I think it's crucial as you get more advanced in your data practices that you have a strong ability to scope out the work that you need to do. A lot of the technical stuff is just being aware that a function exists or understanding how to build functions or understanding how to iterate. The real value is being able to visualize what you're trying to accomplish and articulate the problem that you're trying to solve. So we're going to begin by declaring variables to our data sources. So that means we're going to go to our workbook and we're going to collect our workbook ID and the sheet IDs that we want to send data to. Additionally, we are going to define our destination. In this case, our destination is going to be a folder identification number that houses all of the data endpoints that we want to deliver data to. Then we're going to create an opener function. This is something that I've used in previous videos that allows us to access a workbook, a Google Sheet, by using its ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the folder drive in order to get the IDs of all of the endpoints that we want to deliver data to, and then we're going to use that opener function within another custom function that allows us to access sheets by ID. Now, I have other videos that focus on using getSheetById and the value in doing that. The short rationale for it is that Google Sheets does not have a function that allows you to access sheets by their ID. And it allows you to access it by the name, but the problem is that names change very quickly. So using that name function leaves you very vulnerable. getSheetById helps cut down on errors that you might have in the future. After that, we are going to create a new function called folder extractor that will allow us to access our destination folder in order to extract our workbooks using the getSheetById function. Finally, we are going to extract our data and send it to our destinations. So we're going to create a data delivery function that will use all of the get the opener function, the getSheetById function, the destination folder function in order to take our data from the source and send it to the destination. Cool. So now that we've had that long preamble, let's start coding. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to declare some constants, or they're global constants, that are going to reference our source workbook ID, and then additionally our sheet 1 ID. Now, as we know, sheet 1 ID is 0, so we don't have to go find that, but we are going to have to go to our source workbook in order to get that ID. Additionally, we're going to declare a global constant for our folder ID. And this is going to be within our folder, our main folder hub. We have our subfolder here called data endpoints. We're going to access this identification number. So you can see within the drive.google.com URL, after folders, you have an ID. We're going to use that ID in order to access this folder programmatically. So we're going to paste that in there. Additionally, we're going to go to our demo, automate data for delivery. Again, you can call this whatever you want to. And we're going to access the workbook ID within the URL. and we're going to copy that, and we're going to paste it into our source workbook ID. This is going to allow us to programmatically reference these source and endpoints so that we don't have to worry about names changing or anything like that. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our opener function. And this one is really straightforward. This is something that I made. Again, you can call these functions whatever you want to. These are just the names that I use. So this function is going to require you to pass one argument, which is going to be a workbook ID. All we have to do is just return spreadsheet app dot, it's open by ID, and then that's where we pass in that workbook ID. So basically that's just a placeholder. If you wanted to, you could put X in here. So instead of workbook underscore ID, you could put X or Y or A or B or your own name, whatever you want to. Literally, you're just telling the program that you need to pass something here. In this case, it's a string that contains a Google Sheets workbook ID, and that will ultimately return spreadsheet app.openByID, and then it will open that ID. Cool. So now we're going to create our getSheetByID function. And what we're going to do is we are going to declare that we need two arguments. The first one is going to be the workbook ID, and then the second one is going to be the sheet ID. So what we're going to do now is we are going to create a variable called WB, which will stand for workbook. Again, you can call it whatever you want to. You can type out workbook. You can give it a fancy name, whatever. I'm just calling it WB because that means workbook to me. And then I'm going to call that opener function that we just created. And then I'm going to pass in that WB underscore ID argument, which we are declaring within our function. Again, you could do this as X and Y and then use opener to access X, but it's really just saying that you need to pass something, and the first thing that you pass is going to go into this opener function that is part of the WB variable. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable for sheets, and I'm going to use that WB variable in order to use the getSheets method that is native to AppScript. And what this will do is this just loops through all of the sheets within the workbook that we are in. Finally, I am going to loop through those sheets. So I'm going to use I in sheets, and I am going to say if sheets I dot get sheet ID is equal to that sheet underscore ID variable, then I want it to return a result for a new variable that I'm calling sheet name, and that is going to access the sheets iterator dot get sheet name. Cool. So again, I have another video that goes deeper into why we do this and like all the stuff that we're doing. So if you want to, go check that out. But basically it's because if you do get sheet by name, like we're about to do, WB get sheet by name, this is just like very volatile, because if somebody changes the sheet name unwittingly, which happens to me all the time, literally happened to me the day that I recorded this video, your scripts will break, and then you have to go and do work, and you have to figure out all this stuff that you did. Anyway, this will enable you to access the sheet ID, which will never change unless the workbook gets deleted. So now we have our getSheetByID function, which will allow us to access data and send data to sheets within Google Workbooks. We're going to have to now move on to our next function, which will allow us to access the workbooks in our folder. So we're going to call this folder extractor, and this will require one argument, but we are not going to pass that in yet because this is new and I want to show you how it works. So we're going to begin by creating a variable. Again, you can call this whatever you want to. I'm going to call it folder access because that's effectively what it's doing. And we're going to be referencing drive app. And then we're going to use a method called getFolderByID. And then we are going to reference Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to close these functions down so it's just a little bit easier to read. We're going to reference our static folder ID for now, just so that you can see what's going on here. And what this will allow us to do is access that folder. So we are going to create a new variable called files, and then we are going to reference folder access, that variable we just created, and we are going to get files. Now, this next part is going to move a little bit fast. I'm not an expert in it, but I have consulted the Google Apps Script documentation. And effectively what happens is files, folders within Drive app are, you need to iterate through them. So the documentation recommends that you use the following method in order to do so. So that's why I'm doing it. I don't really have any other explanation other than to say that we are going to reference that files variable, and then we are going to use the hasNext method. You can see that you have a very limited number of methods that you can use once you get the files from your folder. You effectively have to use hasNext. So it's basically while the file has something after it, it will continue to run, and then it will stop running after there's nothing left. So then what we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable for file, and then we're going to reference files again, and then we are going to reference the next method now. So it's just kind of like going through all of the files in the folder until there are none left. And then what we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable for payload, and payload is going to be file.getID. There's lots of stuff that you can do once you get to the hasNext, like you can get the name of the file, or you can get the, in this case, ID. We just want the ID because we want those workbook IDs so that we can pass data to them. So what we'll do now is I just want you to kind of see what happens after we do hasNext, and then I'm going to use some of the other methods in here so that you can, like, if you have other projects that you want to do, you might want to use the name or whatever. So I'm going to use my drop down up here to switch from the opener function to the get sheet by ID down to the folder extractor. Now that I have folder extractor selected, I'm going to run that function. And now you can see we got two ID numbers. And if we go to data point 1, you'll see that we have an ID that is 1Y8CHE8. And then we go back to our script here and check it out. We have 1Y8CHE8. Great. So then for our next one, it should be 1ZFR5, and we go to data endpoint number 2, and you can see we get 1ZFR5. So we can confirm that our folder extractor function is doing precisely what we want it to. What I'm going to do real quick, just so that you can see some of the other methods that exist in here, you can see that you can do a lot of stuff, right? Like you can get access, you can get the date created, you can get the editors, you can get the IDs, you can get last updated date, you can get name, right? So I'm going to enter in the get name one, and we're going to rerun it, and what we should get is data endpoint 1, data endpoint 2. So you can see that, like, there's a lot of value that can come from this folder extractor function, and that you may have multiple use cases that this could help you solve for. For our purposes, we just want to get the ID, so I'm going to change this back to get ID, and then I'm going to get that going. And then what we also have to do, though, is we have to push those IDs into an array so that we can access them at a later date. So what we're going to do now is we are going to declare another variable called files list, and we are going to create it as an empty array. So basically what happens is, like, data is structured in arrays. I have another video that dives, like, very deeply into what arrays are and how they're structured in data. But effectively, we need to create an array of these workbook IDs. So we're going to use files list. So we're going to reference that empty array up top here. So we're going to call that, and then we're going to use the push method that will push the payload variable into the files ID list. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do logger.log files list, and I'm going to run that. And now, instead of being 2 data points, you can see it's now 1 data point existing in a list. And you can tell it's a list because it has those 2 brackets, and then the 2 values are separated by a comma, which is exactly what we want. So now what we're going to do is we're going to delete logger.log, and we're going to delete that extra parentheses and semicolon, and then we're going to use the return statement in order to return this files list. So we're going to use, and I'm going to save it now so that we can move on. Now we can call this folder extractor function in our final push here to send data to multiple workbooks. But before we do that, I'm going to change that static folder ID to a dynamic folder ID. And I am going to say folder ID, which all this is doing, again, is just saying that the folder extractor function takes 1 argument. That is going to be a folder ID, which is a string. So we're going to save it again. And what we'll do is we're going to close this function up so that we have a nice, clean space to work in. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create one last function that is effectively going to be our star of the show, right? So this is going to be a function that I call data delivery. And it's not going to take any arguments because we just need it so that we can push data. So what we're going to do first is we're going to tap our data source. So I'm going to declare a variable called data source, and I am going to use my getSheetById function. And as we know, it takes 2 arguments. In this case, we are going to use the source WBID, and we are also going to use the sheet1 ID. And the reason that we're using the source workbook ID and the sheet1 ID is because our data exists in sheet 1, right? So it has an ID of 0, and then the workbook ID is 1DKVOO, right? So that's what we want. So now we have our data source. Now what we're going to do is create a variable for data. And what we're going to do now is reference the data source variable, and we're going to use the getRange method, and we're going to start at row 1, column 1, and then we're going to reference data source dot get last row, because we want the very last row of data from this source no matter where it is. And then we're going to reference data source get last column, because we want the entire range so that if it dynamically expands or contracts, we will still collect everything. And then finally, we're going to use the get display values method so that if there's any special formatting, that will get pulled in, and then we can push it out. Now what we're going to do is access our endpoints. So in order to do that, we're going to create a new variable called endpoints. And you know what? I'm going to just call it endpoints, no caps or anything. And then I'm going to call my folder extractor function. And what I'm going to pass to it is this static folder ID up there, right? And that's all we have to do there. And then we're going to loop through that endpoints variable. So we're going to say for I in endpoints. Then we're going to do a curly bracket, and we are going to create a new WB variable. And within that, we're going to use the getSheetById function. And then we're going to call endpoints, and we're going to do a bracket, and then we're going to call that I, because we're going to iterate through all of the endpoints. If you recall, when we were in the folder extractor, when we were testing to see if it was running, we ended up getting a bracket and an ID, and then a comma, and then another ID. When you use this bracket and the iterator, which is I, you'll loop through each value in your variable. In this case, it's the endpoint. So what will happen is this endpoints I will take the workbook ID that we're collecting from our folder extractor function, and it will pass it in here. And then we have to give it a sheet that we want to send the data to. In this case, we're going to do sheet1 ID. And what we'll be able to do now is we can now reference that workbook variable, and we're going to say get range, and we are going to start at row 1, column 1, and then we're going to do workbook dot get get max rows, and workbook dot get get max columns. And as we've talked about in previous videos, the reason that we do this is because we need to clear out the entirety of the workbook, regardless of like how much data is coming in or out, because data expands and contracts. So if you want to see an example of that, like I said, I talk about it in my level 2 data automation video. So now that we've cleared the range, we can send the data. So we're going to do wb.getRange, and we're going to start at row 1, column 1, and then we're going to reference the data source again, because we need to know what the last row is in the data source, right? So if the data source has 30 rows, then we need to prepare 30 rows for data delivery. Additionally, we have to reference the data source dot get last column, because we also have to prep it for the appropriate amount of columns. And then what we can do is we can set values to our data variable. And now our script should be done. So what we're going to do now is we're going to see that we have our data endpoint 1 here. We're on sheet 2. Our data endpoint 1 is empty in sheet 1. When we go over to data endpoint 2, it also is empty in sheet 1. And then we're going to take all of the data from our demo workbook and we're going to send it into those 2 workbooks. So we got an invalid ID at row 30. So let's check out what this error is. Row 30 is the get folder ID in here. So we're accessing folder access drive, get folder by ID, folder ID. Why is that not working? Oh, I'm sorry, because we still have this folder extractor going. So now we just have to change it to data delivery. My bad. So now we're going to run it. Cool, it worked perfectly, I think. So you can see we have our demo workbook, and then our data endpoint 2 got updated, and our data endpoint 1 got updated. So that rules, okay? What's really cool about this, though, is that, if somebody in the future wants their own data endpoint workbook, all you have to do is make a copy of it. So for example, you could go into data endpoint number 2, make a copy, and we're going to call this data endpoint 3. And what we'll do is we're going to clear this out just so that you can see that there's like no data in here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to rerun our script, and we're going to go to data endpoint 3. And what should happen now is data gets pushed in there, right? So what's really cool about this method of using the folder drives like this is that you can add and delete things at your will, right? That way, if somebody comes into the organization and you want to give them their own workbook, boom, you send them the template and they have a workbook that will update every single day, and you don't have to touch anything. Early in my career, I used import range for a lot of my data delivery methods. And the challenge with import range is that anytime I would make a copy, I would have to go in and I have to allow access. And basically what ends up happening is like you end up doing a bunch of manual work in order to facilitate something that is kind of sort of automated. This multi-sheet delivery script is fully automated, right? You no longer have the vulnerability with sheet names changing. You have the ability to add and remove workbooks whenever you want to. Again, if you want to automate this, you can go to the triggers field in Google Apps Script and then add a trigger. In some of my previous videos, I accidentally did not use the right function. So just make sure that you pick the correct function, in this case, data delivery. And then you can use the time-driven function if you want to. And then you can do an hour, a minute, a day, a week, a month timer. You could specify the date and time specifically. And then you just set it and forget it. Now, as I mentioned when we opened up the script, scoping is very important. And what I would encourage you to do is think about, like, what is the problem that you're attempting to solve? And then once you solve that problem, identifying what additional things might come up. I think a great resource to consider here is developing data visualization tools. If you're interested in one example of data viz, I have a dashboard build video, which I'll link up in the end screen. Otherwise, please check out my channel. I have some more automation videos coming up. I hope you found this one helpful. I'm always looking for feedback, so hit up that comment section, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video.